In 1966, having just fired their manager of 3 years, Giorgio Gomelsky, the Yardbirds got in Simon Napier-Bell to be their manager. Napier-Bell had co-written the #1 hit song You Don't Have to Say You Love Me by Dusty Springfield, and was still in his early days as a manager, but would go on to manage successfully T-Rex, Boney M, Ultravox and Wham, among others. Napier-Bell proved to be a much more conventional manager than Gomelsky and renegotiated their publishing contract, instantly getting them a huge advance on royalties from EMI. After a short tour of France, where Jeff Beck got food poisoning and fell down a flight of stairs, possibly related to the nervous exhaustion he was feeling, the band returned to London to record their next single, just as Shapes of Things was still riding high in the charts. For this one, they started off with a jam based around Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, with Beck on bass. Then Beck added an insane Middle Eastern inspired fuzz guitar riff over the top of it, and it became an instant psych rock classic. Over Under Sideways Down is completely unhinged raga rock and roll, rock around the minaret, if you like. Despite this very much avant-garde approach to 4 on the floor rock and roll, the single was another hit, top 10 in the UK and number 13 in the US. The song's lyrics perfectly articulated the view of youth culture of the time. When I was young, people spoke of immorality. All the things they said were wrong are what I want to be, which fits in beautifully with the genuinely new sonic smorgasbord the Yardbirds and Beck were playing with. Another example of the lyrical content and music of the group working in perfect harmony together. One idea that Gomelsky had that Napier-Bell had approved of was that individual members of the band should try and bring more attention to the group by having successful solo projects. So, during a rare week off from touring, Keith Relf recorded a solo single, Mr. Zero, and Jeff Beck went into the IBC studio with his old friend Jimmy Page, that is, to do something also. They had started off with an idea for something that sounded a bit like Ravel's Bolero, Page strumming a 12-string acoustic guitar with a Bolero-esque rhythm. From there, the two guitarists built an instrumental up with a distinctively guitar melody and, at Beck's insistence, a rocking middle section that completely diverged from the main structure, much like the Yardbirds had been doing in their song. To play the drum part, Beck wanted Keith Moon from The Who. Moon was at the time apparently unhappy with The Who, so was eager to do it, as long as he could do it anonymously without either Pete Townsend or The Who's manager Kit Lambert finding out. Moon also suggested The Who's John Entwistle, also a bit unhappy, could join on bass. When it came to the recording, attempting to go incognito, Keith Moon arrived at the studio wearing sunglasses and a Russian Cossack hat. Beck was just surprised that he had turned up at all. Entwistle did not show up, so Beck got in a talented young session musician by the name of John Paul Jones to play the bass, and got Nicky Hopkins to play the piano, who had done sessions for the Kinks and The Who. With Glyn Johns engineering the session, the result was possibly the greatest rock instrumental of all time, in my opinion. Beck's Bolero, which didn't see the light of day until it was released as the B-side to, spoiler alert, Jeff Beck's solo single, Hi Ho Silver Lining, in 1967. For a brief moment, Beck thought they had formed the greatest band of all time. Jeez, this is the beginning of something amazing, he said. You guys aren't going anywhere. But the next day, he said it was over. Now, the Yardbirds had previously started work on a new album before the departure of Gomelsky, so now they picked it up again, with Paul Samuel Smith taking over production duties at Advision Studios in London. Having only 5 days to record, the band had to work quickly, writing songs on the fly in the studio. Samuel Smith lamented this lack of time, saying afterwards that if they had had, say, a month, the results would have been fantastic. Well, actually, despite the time constraint, what resulted was fantastic. A perfect mixture of all the different sides of the band that they had shown through their singles and live performances up until this point. Chicago blues, droning psychedelia, playful experimentation, rave-ups, pop songs, mournful dirges, and of course absolutely astonishing guitar solos, played on Beck's new 1959 Sunburst Gibson Les Paul. The opening song, Lost Woman, takes high-energy R&B riffing into outer space with an extended rave-up full of fuzzed-out power chords and feedback, with a droning bass that is truly psychedelic. The Nas Are Blue takes Chicago blues and Beckifies it, with Jeff singing the lead vocal for the first, but not the only time, as a Yardbird. Based on Elmore James's version of Robert Johnson's Dust My Broom. It was originally recorded as an instrumental when Gomelsky was still around, but then resurrected with overdubs, and instead of a regular guitar solo, Beck delivered the ultimate one-note solo. After a short preamble of notes, Beck plays a single sustained note that rings out across the remainder of the instrumental section, bending slightly, holding it until it starts to feed back. Everyone in the room at the time thought Beck was just having them on. Everyone was saying, "What was that? You fucked it up," Napier-Bell said. But then they heard the playback and it sounded fantastic. To this day, he said, "I don't know whether it was deliberate or whether he did it just to piss off the band." In fact, it was both. "I was twiddling my fingers, waiting for my chance to get in and rip it in half," Beck said later. "I think Jeff was tired and genuinely angry with the way he was being treated," Napier-Bell said later. Beck also showcased his abilities on Jeff's Boogie, which was partly based on Chuck Berry's Guitar Boogie. The Yardbirds version swings like crazy, whilst Beck throws everything in the kitchen sink into the short solo sections, going beyond Chuck Berry, incorporating inspiration from Les Paul, Buddy Guy and Gene Vincent's guitarist Cliff Gallup. Beck runs up and down the fretboard with complete abandon. Wild, joyous and funny. It was dismissed by Beck, of course, as just a loony thing I came up with, as filler material, but mere filler has no right to be this entertaining, or so influential on guitarists for decades afterwards. Then there's Rack My Mind, a kinetic take on Chicago blues that for me shares the same headspace as Shake For Me by Howlin' Wolf, with Beck's outrageous solos channeling Wolf's brilliant guitarist Hubert Sumlin. There's no accurate way to describe the hot house of Omega Rashid because it seems to exist in a genre of its own making, taking a Bo Diddley beat and doing unspeakable things to it, involving wobble boards and what sounds like spoons tinkling on glasses. The song starts off with some sort of vocal declaration shouted in some as yet unidentified language, followed by 2.5 minutes of sheer unabashed joy that is absurdly enjoyable, and it's worth listening to the mono mix as Beck's glorious solo towards the end of the song is sadly missing from the stereo mix. And actually the stereo mixes of this album are, in my opinion, mixed way too separated. I prefer the mono version. He's Always There showcases how brilliantly creative the band were at this time. The rhythms, the hand claps, the bass lines, the background vocal chanting, the fuzz guitar all come together to form an incredible groove that comes to a crescendo with Beck's wailing fuzz solo at the end. What Do You Want was clearly inspired by Bo Diddley's Who Do You Love in terms of the cadence of the chorus and the pace of the rhythm, but again the Yardbirds take the template and they run off into their own world with it. It's also another example of Beck's mastery of incorporating feedback into his solos, with his ringing fuzz solo towards the end helping the song soar off into the sunset. And, well, call me crazy, but I've always thought that the Bangles song Walk Like an Egyptian took some of the vibe from this song, maybe, in my opinion. Turn Into Earth and Ever Since the World Began pick up where Still I'm Sad left off, developing a gloomy, intense and dramatic form of psychedelia that would eventually become a part of the basic vocabulary of heavy metal. The latter, in particular, but for a Tomi Iommi riff, could easily pass for a Black Sabbath song. Ever since the world began, Satan's followed every man, decrying humanity's weakness for war, profit and greed at the expense of human life. Although the album was simply titled officially Yardbirds, it came to be known as Roger the Engineer due to Chris Dreher's cartoon of Roger Cameron, the studio engineer at Advision, being used as the cover art. In my opinion, this album deserves way more praise than what it's got over the years, overshadowed maybe by some of the many other great works that were released in this year. Roger the Engineer is nevertheless a stone-cold psychedelic classic, an important development in the history of rock, not least due to Beck's contributions to the art of playing his instrument, but also due to the sheer creativity of the band as a whole. With most of the album completed in 5 days, there would in fact be a further session on the 14th of June, which produced the song I Can't Make Your Way. The band were back out touring the UK with no break. Literally, they had been in the studio making the album from the 31st of May to the 4th of June, and then according to the website concertarchives.org, on the night of 4th of June they were playing at Middlesex College, which, to be fair, was just a half an hour's drive across London from Advision Studios in Fitzrovia. This almost constant touring was beginning to take its toll on Jeff Beck. He was exhausted not only physically but mentally, as the band were increasingly reliant on him to deliver some mad stroke of genius to elevate their music. I think we put him under real pressure, Chris Dreyer said later. To expect him to come up with miracles every time just wasn't fair. Around this time, Beck would have a habit of going missing, and Napier-Bell would have to track him down, usually finding him at his parents' house in South London, where he would take some convincing to come back and rejoin the group. I was 20 when I went from rags to riches. It had started to mess me up, Beck said later. And it wasn't just Beck that was struggling with the demands of being in a now successful group. Paul Samwell Smith was finding himself much more comfortable behind the desk rather than on stage. And things came to a head on June the 18th when the Yardbirds played the Oxford May Ball at Oxford University. The student committee had spent a small fortune hiring the services of the Hollies, as well as the Yardbirds, for the prestigious occasion. In contrast to their usual gigs, the audience here would be dressed formally, with black ties and the ladies in dresses. As befitting such an event, there was also no end of food and, crucially, drink laid on for all to consume, as well as plenty of free time to relax between sets. This was a recipe for disaster for the Yardbirds, as Keith Relf took the opportunity to drink as much alcohol as humanly possible. Yep, Keith was on one, Jim McCarty said. Challenged by Alan Clark of the Hollies to perform karate moves on various pieces of furniture and metal trays, Relf broke 3 of his fingers. Luckily, he was so drunk he didn't feel the pain until about 2 days later. Relf performed the first set of the night with little or no problems. However, after continuing to booze backstage in the breaks between sets, by the time the Yardbirds were back on stage for their second set, Relf was completely shit-faced. He forgot the lyrics and didn't really seem to know where he was, McCarty said. And then he started taking the piss out of all these hooray Henrys, blowing raspberries, that kind of thing. Whilst the inebriated singer rolled around, wrestling with the microphone, singing nonsense words, a laughing Beck happily filled in any missing vocals with extended guitar solos. But Samwell Smith was not amused. In fact, he was furious with Rolf and berated the singer as soon as they got off stage. Paul felt it was important to act stiff in front of all these academic types, Dreyer said. So in his mind, Keith really let him down. For Samwell Smith, it was the last straw. He just quit the band there and then. One onlooker, however, found it all rather entertaining. I went backstage and there was a huge argument going on with Paul leaving the group. He said, "I thought it was brilliant, this marvellous anarchistic night." I said, "I'll play bass if you like." That onlooker was Jimmy Page, who had come along, invited by Beck. They had travelled to the gig together in Beck's Ford Zephyr 6. By this time, Page was no longer content just doing session work. He had been going to gigs at the Marquee and Eel Pie and could see it was all happening. "I wanted in," he said. Napier-Bell already knew Page from his time organising recording sessions, but his instinct told him 2 guitarists with 2 egos such as this would not work together in the group. But they all kept saying, he said, no, he's just going to play bass. Beck was delighted to have Page join the band, as it made him feel less isolated. 3 days after the Oxford gig, Jimmy Page played his first date as a Yardbird at the Marquee. As a welcome present, Beck gave his mate a 1959 Fender Telecaster, which in time Page would make his own by painting in the psychedelic style. It would become his main guitar for the next several years. For the next Yardbirds single, the band went with a concept Relf and McCarty had come up with during an LSD trip at Relf's flat, a song about reincarnation and deja vu. In the studio, John Paul Jones, from Beck's Bolero, played bass on the recording, freeing up Page to work on guitar parts with Beck. With a Still I'm Sad like Gregorian chant chorus, multiple lead guitars, churning riffs, guitars sounding like sirens and bombs going off. In Happenings 10 years time ago, the Yardbirds had perfected the art of creating psychedelic rock music that complemented and illustrated the lyrics to a T, emulating the confusion of sinking deep into the well of time. And as if the Page and Beck dual guitar attack wasn't enough, Beck performed a note-perfect vocal impersonation of a doctor who had examined members of the group at a sexual health clinic. Pop group, are you? Why you all got long hair? Upon hearing it, the band reportedly fell about laughing, so of course it had to stay on the record, McCarthy said. Happenings is perhaps the band's greatest group effort, a true collaboration of all the band members pulling together towards the fulfillment of the song's potential. The song still sounds like nothing else on earth, exploding through the speakers from a now distant time, appropriately enough, as if it were here and now. Truly psychedelic in every sense of the word. Exciting, unsettling, epic and deranged. Going from the verse to the instrumental section feels like being pulled through a wormhole, then ejected the other side, forever changed by the experience. Beck and Page also feature together on the B-side, Daisies, which takes Chuck Berry and adds massive thrashing proto-metal riffage to the equation with slyly funny lyrics sung by Beck himself, even name-checking his smoking hot blonde Californian girlfriend, Mary Hughes. At only 1 minute 50 seconds, Daisies is one of the most punk-sounding pre-punk rock songs, though because this is the Yardbirds, they couldn't help do something else that was new as well. This time they swing the beat during the singing parts of the verses, and then they go straight as they thrash that one chord of the riff. The Yardbirds' third visit to the USA was delayed at the end of July when Beck went down with tonsillitis, eventually arriving 4th of August for a month of shows that would see the band end up in Honolulu for a show. Although over the tonsillitis, Beck says he was shattered before he even got on the plane. This time, the band were due to play a number of state fairs in the South and the Midwest, as well as the usual big urban centres. Although the counterculture and the fashions were changing, for young people at least, in 1966 places like Wichita and Tulsa, for example, hadn't yet got the psychedelic memo. We always used to wear our stage gear out in the street, and there was an incident every day, Beck said later. We were threatened with knives, guns, you name it. Dreyer agreed with Beck, but he also added, it wasn't just America, you were just as likely to be beaten up in Dumfries or John O'Groats as in Texas. With the US also getting further mired into the Vietnam War at this time, Chris Dreyer recalls seeing aluminium coffins being unloaded from the back of planes along with luggage. Exhausted by the relentless schedule, constant travelling and the ever-present threat of confrontation, Beck started taking out his bottled-up frustration and anger on his guitar amps on stage, jabbing his guitar neck into the speaker cone. If it went up in a cloud of smoke, I was happy, Beck said. It was a nightmare for Napier-Bell, who was dealing with an airline strike as well, having to fly the band round the States on a charter plane. When Jeff smashed up his amp, he was left with nothing, Napier-Bell said. Suppliers would refuse to provide Voxes or Marshalls. There were only about 20 Marshalls in the States at this time, meaning Napier-Bell not only had to charter a plane, but pretty much buy a brand new amp before every gig. Not only that, but these were the very early days of rock, where a venue's PA might turn out to be basically non-existent, not even to the standard of a small club in London. I'd fly in rages and tantrums, purposely play the wrong notes, and bend strings in complete contempt of the situation, Beck said, though he also admitted that that ended up being a part of his guitar style. He even, apparently, pushed one lackluster amp out of a window at a second-floor venue in Phoenix. According to Beck, the only thing that stopped it falling to the street below was that it had a locking plug, leaving it dangling on the outside of the building. It wasn't all bad, of course. The Yardbirds eventually got back to the promised land of California and played an amazing gig at the Casino Ballroom on Catalina Island on August the 23rd, with Napier-Bell recalling that Beck played a 5-minute blues solo that was right up there with B.B. King. Beck's illness, though, had never fully gone away, and a couple of nights later he collapsed and was unable to play the San Francisco date. Instead, Jimmy Page took over lead guitar duties whilst Dreyer took over the bass. Page recalls being nervous about taking over from Beck, as it was the height of the Yardbirds' concert reputation, he said, and I wasn't exactly ready to roar off and lead guitar, but it went alright. After that night, Dreyer stayed on bass, and Page stayed on guitar. And when Beck came back, from then on, the Yardbirds would have something unprecedented in the short history of rock and roll up until that point. Two shit-hot, flamboyant, innovative and flashy virtuoso guitarists on lead guitar. Recovering from his illness, Beck spent a few days with Mary Hughes and then returned to the UK without the band, who played the remaining dates with just Page on the guitar. When the band returned, everyone, especially Beck, was into the two lead guitars idea, and the pair rehearsed together at Page's house, working out unison licks, dual harmonies and other things they could do together. It was good, Page said. It worked well, we could harness our collective energy. The first gig with this monstrous new lineup was supporting the Rolling Stones at the Royal Albert Hall, with Ike and Tina Turner also on the bill. Ike Turner was in fact one of the founding fathers of rock and roll. His arrangement for the jump blues song Rocket 88, as recorded by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats at Sun Studios in 1951, was the prototype rock and roll record, complete with overdriven guitar and a rocking beat. Assuming these pale-faced Brits would have little in the way of instrumental prowess, Turner was stunned when he heard Beck warming up backstage, exclaiming to Tina, "Man, these guys can really play over here." The Yardbirds went down a storm at the Royal Albert Hall, with Beck and Napier-Bell both feeling that the crowd had loved the dual guitar antics. The New Musical Express, however, dismissed the band's and Beck's performance as average, which rattled Beck, and as a result became highly suspicious of any music journalist he spoke to for many years afterwards. The two guitarists weren't always in perfect unison. Beck, of course, never played a song the same way twice. Some nights it would be chaos, but some nights things would just click, and the combination of Beck and Page would just leave audiences in awe. One reason why it wasn't always perfect was Beck's mental state at the time. "I was frustrated with the business and not wanting to play in front of people, but having to do it," he said later, "and I was acting like a naughty boy, really." After touring the UK with the Stones and the Turners, the band appeared in Michael Antonioni's movie Blow Up, which was being filmed in London at this time. Antonioni's first choice of band to appear in the film was The Who, as he loved the way the band smashed up their instruments, and he wanted to feature that in the film. Napier-Bell knew about this, and says he advised Kit Lambert to ask for £10,000 and complete control of the edit of the scene, knowing that Antonioni would refuse this, leaving him free to step in and offer the Yardbirds services instead. Napier-Bell called the director and told him the Yardbirds were much better at smashing their instruments than The Who, and it worked. He secured the gig. The band found the movie shoot completely bizarre compared to their normal work. For 3 minutes of screen time, McCarthy said, "We had to turn up for about 5 days." The band was also stunned to see their old haunt, the Ricky Tick Club in Windsor, had been recreated at Elstree Studios with an uncanny level of accuracy, brick by brick, cobweb for cobweb, Page said. The band also had no clue as to what the actual purpose of the film was. "Nobody in the crew seemed to know what it was all about either when we asked them," Page said later. Antonioni explained to the band that they would be performing a song to a completely emotionless audience before one of them, Beck, naturally, was meant to get really annoyed with their equipment and smash the guitar up. Not too much of a stretch then. A whole bunch of cheap Hofner guitars were smashed during the filming after Beck had refused to use his Gibson Les Paul. For the performance, the band was originally meant to be playing Smokestack Lightning, but Antonioni wanted something a bit more energetic, so the band did Train Kept A-Rolling instead. But presumably because Antonioni didn't want to pay for the rights to the song to go in the movie, they changed the lyrics, and it became a song called Stroll On instead, but it's exactly the same. The band's appearance in the film gave us the only really high quality footage of the Beck and Page lineup in existence. As such, you can see an impressive amount of detail, maybe too much actually, due to the tightness of Beck's trousers. I had a fucking hard on, man. He had taken his mum along to see the film, not expecting to see his tumescent junk so prevalently featured on the silver screen. The band returned to the USA at the end of October, where they embarked on the very glamorous sounding Dick Clark's Caravan of Stars tour. The schedule was grueling, 33 shows in 27 days across 16 states. Of the 33 shows, 25 of the shows were doubles, meaning 2 shows in one night, often not just at the same venue, but in 2 different towns. As soon as the first half had finished, the first half's acts would get onto the bus to go to the next town, while the second half continued on with the remaining acts. More like the caravan of hell, Chris Dreyer said. We were human beings stuck in a rat hole. Old Greyhound buses with all the seats still installed. It was a bit like being sectioned. You don't know why you're there, because you're actually sane. Stuck on a bus for hundreds of miles between shows with Brian Hyland, Gary Lewis and the Playboys, and Sam Sham and the Pharaohs. The members of the Yardbirds dealt with the situation in different ways. Dreyer and McCarthy used humour as their escape. Page just went further into his professional mode. Ralph, of course, relied on booze to escape. Beck, however, chose just to, escape. After a date in Corpus Christi, Texas, Beck went nuts and smashed his Les Paul. He had finally snapped. After months of illness, nervous exhaustion, and missing his Californian girlfriend, the caravan of hell pushed Beck to breaking point. Stuffed like an animal in a bus with 50 other people driving 600 miles to play a couple of songs, Beck said later, I freaked out and left the band. There was also the creative side of things. I didn't write, he later said. All I did was wait for them to come up with this threadbare stuff, and I would try and make something of it, for which I hardly saw any money. Jeff Beck flew the next day to California to be with Mary Hughes, whilst the Yardbirds continued on, with Jimmy Page taking over full-time as the band's sole lead guitarist. So, how would the band do with just Jimmy Page on lead guitar? We'll take a look in the next episode, the final episode, episode 4. Until then, if you're not subscribed, please do. Give us a thumbs up. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. But that's all from me on this one. Bye for now.